Hey everyone, on this episode of Teeter Talks, I had an incredible conversation with Camille Dundas. She is a racial equity educator. She has a background in journalism and being a news producer, and she's now the editor-in-chief of BuyBlacks.com. She's the founder of the IDEA practice, and she spends her time working with people, professionals, organizations, teaching about diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is a great conversation. I hope from this you see that we need to have these tough conversations. We need to understand the language that will empower us to be better educated, to be great allies, to really know what we're talking about and to be able to do something about it. We lean into tough topics, but it's such a fulfilling conversation and you're going to learn so much. Everyone, please enjoy my conversation with Camille Dundas. Hi, Camille.
Hi, Marissa.
It's great to see you finally. I feel like I've been a fan and following you and your amazing work for so many years, and I'm just so thrilled that you're taking the time to be on Teeter Talks with me. So I just want to say thank you.
You're welcome. I'm so excited to be here.
So it's interesting. It's almost as if you and I planned this to record this podcast at this very moment in time. And we'll get into why later. But it seems as though these conversations around equity and diversity and inclusion are very relevant and top of mind for people these days. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I thought maybe we'd start. You spend a lot of time educating around racial equity. And I wondered if maybe we could level set with just what some words and terms mean so that we can all be on the same page. And I thought maybe we'd start with that word equity. And then maybe you could go a little deeper specifically into the work you do and what it means when we talk about racial equity.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thanks so much for having me here. I was so excited when you reached out. So it's good to finally get ourselves on the calendar. When we're talking about equity and specifically in racial equity, it's good to think about it in relation to equality, because I noticed that a lot of people either mistake these two for each other or use them interchangeably. Equality, everyone is much more familiar with. That's very easy to understand. Equality means everyone gets treated the same and is granted the same resources and access to everything. Whereas equity recognizes that not everyone is starting from the same place. So everyone gets treated fairly based on their own specific circumstances, right? So, for example, there's a quote that says, equality is giving everyone a shoe, equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits.
Yes.
Right? Another example is that's easy to think about is I read this interesting theory research that was done, a study that was done into women's bathrooms or bathrooms in a theater in the UK. And what they found, they were looking at equity, and they because they're like, well, let's solve this worldwide problem of women always being the ones to line up for a long time outside the bathrooms. So the men's and the women's bathrooms were the same square footage. So we can say that's equality because you got the same space, right? And then they started to look at, wait, what are actually the factors that cause women to be waiting for a longer period of time? What they're finding is that women are more likely to have someone else to care for in the bathroom, either a child or an older person. And of course, you and I know there's just lots of other stuff that sometimes women have to do in the bathroom.
Yeah.
And they found that, women do actually need more bathrooms or bigger sizes of bathrooms. And so if we're looking at that, I find that a really easy one to understand because everyone goes to the bathroom. And we're thinking about, okay, that would be equality, really. It just because they had the same number of bathrooms, the same size of bathrooms. But it is equity if we increase the size and number of women's bathrooms because we need more.
That's really smart. I don't know why this hasn't been thought of sooner. It almost seems so logical. And ironically, by providing equity, I don't think the men would be kicking and screaming about it. And I think the women would be thrilled about it. So that's a really great example. I think that's one that can help people visualize what this means. What about racial equity? Because you do a lot of work in this space. Can you elaborate a little bit on
Yeah.
that?
So obviously, when we're thinking about, well, I think we should start with racism first, because that's the whole reason we even need racial equity in the first place. And a lot of us feel we know what racism is, right? And very often, just like equality and equity, we use different terms interchangeably, like prejudice or discrimination. Everyone has prejudices. Everyone has discriminated against someone else in their lifetime. Prejudices are your thoughts, your feelings, your attitudes towards other groups of people. All of us have them. We can't avoid them. None of us can avoid our socialization. In fact, the ideas we've picked up since we were toddlers are some of the hardest to change. Discrimination is an action that is based on that prejudice. So that can look like intentional ignoring, any type of exclusion, threats, jokes, violence. Now, when a group's collective prejudices and discrimination, so think of the prejudices as the thoughts, discrimination as the action. When a group's collective prejudices and discrimination is supported by legal authority, by institutional control, it is transformed into racism, specifically institutional racism or systemic racism. Of course, we all are more familiar with interpersonal racism. But if we want to flesh this out further, think about the women's right to vote. Women could be prejudiced against men, right? We could technically discriminate against men in individual interactions. But if we think back before women had the right to vote, collectively as a group, we had no power to oppress men. We had no power to withhold the rights of men. Whereas men did have that power and did, in fact, deny us our right to vote. The only way women could get the right to vote was if men gave it to us. So it's about power. And I will say there is not collective agreement on the exact definition of racism or who can or cannot be racist. There is not a collective agreement about this. I'll leave it there. If you read the works of different scholars, you'll see that there isn't one agreed upon definition.
It's interesting because I think people want to be so clear and, by the book on these things to be certain they're on the right side or, the favored side, if you will, to be clear. But it's important to your point to understand that there's a lot of gray areas in this regard. And so, as we continue on this path of understanding words and, the words that matter as we get into this conversation, there's another one that seems to come up a lot. But I also think it's sometimes misunderstood, and that's the concept of allyship. Can
Yeah.
you elaborate a little bit on allyship for us?
Yeah. Well, first, anyone, no matter your identity, can practice allyship. And I wanted to get into the habit of talking about practicing allyship because it is a practice. It is something that we have to do all the time. It's not a destination or a checklist. It's big and small choices that we make every day to understand how oppression benefits some groups and steals from other groups. Allyship is really an active, consistent, and difficult practice of unlearning, reevaluating, in which we look at our position of privilege and power and we seek to operate in solidarity with any historically marginalized group. Now, Marissa, saying you're an ally is a lot easier than actually being one. Saying you're an ally looks really good on paper, especially if you've never been questioned or questioned yourself about your own inaction. So allies recognize that even though they are not a member or part of an underinvested or historically marginalized community, they are going to make a concerted effort to better understand the challenges that those groups face every single day.
I like that.
So I would say it's a combination of reflection and action.
Yeah, and it seems very timely because I think, and I alluded to it earlier, you and I are recording this just a few days after the US election, where Donald Trump defeated Kamala Harris to become the next president of the United States. And I see a lot of talk online, I see a lot of words. And I don't think activism and allyship is putting words on the internet. And we're missing the action piece. We're missing the doing something about it piece. And I don't know. Do you agree with that thought? And maybe, what are you seeing in the wake around people commenting and sharing? And I think trying to create a movement to reflect, but are the words enough?
Just because the words aren't enough doesn't mean they should not be spoken.
Hmm. Okay.
So continue to throw those words on the internet. Continue to post, continue to have your thoughts be heard, continue to have those conversations at home, in the workplace, wherever you encounter them. But the point is, it cannot or should not stop there.
Right.
The most difficult challenge that any of us face in the practice of allyship is looking at us right in the mirror.
Hmm.
It's not our opponent. It's not the person who disagrees with us. It's ourselves. Because it is way more difficult to examine the ways in which we have participated in any kind of oppression, unfairness, upholding systemic unfairness, benefited from it. That is way more difficult than calling it out in somebody else.
Hmm. Yeah. And I guess I was going to ask you this question later, but I feel it's probably a good time to talk about it now, is this idea of privilege.
Mhm.
And I think some people who have it struggle with acknowledging that they have privilege and maybe don't fully understand what that entails. How would you define privilege?
I define it as a superpower.
Mm.
That may sound strange, but that's how I've always seen it, because it is not this dirty word that conjures up these very defensive feelings most times, if we think about it in this way. Because, like the great Beyonce says, I woke up like this. All of us woke up. All of us wake up every day in the bodies we were given, in the skin tone we were given, with the abilities we were given, etc., etc. We did not work for any of these particular primary identifiers that often give us privileges. However, it is not to say that we haven't worked hard for the other things we have achieved in life. Acknowledging that I have privilege doesn't take away anything from how hard I worked for my university degree, doesn't take away from how hard I worked at all the jobs that I held, my career milestones. But how can I not look back on my career and not observe the moments in which I did benefit from some type of privilege? Even though I have faced discrimination, even though I have had difficulties. So, acknowledging privilege doesn't mean that you haven't worked hard. What it does mean, when we're talking about racism specifically, it means, if you are a white person, it means that of all the difficulties and challenges that you have had, none of those have been because you are white. But for other groups, sometimes the challenges we come upon have been simply because we are a woman, simply because we are a person of color, and so on, simply because we are queer, simply because we are disabled. And so I come back to seeing it as a privilege, as a superpower, because I can do something with it. It's just there. You know what privilege is like? It's like having $100,000 in the bank account, in your bank account. and say, you know what? No, no, not going to touch that. No, I'm not ever going to spend it. Spend it. My dad used to have a saying, you don't go to heaven with your pockets.
It's a good one. Yeah.
Spend it. Do something with it. What is the point of having money that you don't spend ever? So, what is the point of having privilege if you don't use it for good? And we can talk about the ways in which you use it. That is called the practice of allyship. But don't see it as something that you have to be ashamed of. I'm not ashamed of any of the parts of myself. I'm not ashamed. I don't have to feel shame to recognize, yes, I had the privilege of being in a two-parent home, of being able to afford to go to university, of having a higher education, of the privilege of being able to immigrate to live in Canada. Of course, that came with lots of different challenges, but there are many of the privilege of English being my first language, light skin privilege. There are many privileges, able-bodied privilege. I can go on and on
Hmm.
that have made my life just a little bit easier than somebody else's, even though my life has been difficult in some areas. These two things can be true at once. It's okay to acknowledge that.
I love that. And I think one of the greatest examples I ever heard, that I think when there was a group of people sitting in a room who, maybe to your point, fought their privilege or didn't want to acknowledge their privilege, or kind of said, well, I can't control that. I was just born this way, to your point. Maybe not seeing it as a positive that they could leverage for good. I love that you position it as a superpower. But one of the greatest examples, and you kind of alluded to it, was, someone who is disabled, waking up and having to go about their day in a wheelchair every day. And if you and I want to go to the movies, I suspect we just check the times, we get in our car, and we go to the movies. If this person wants to go to the movies, are they going to a movie theater that has a ramp? What is the journey from where they are to get to a mode of transportation to get into the movie theater? Will they get to the movie theater that's wheelchair accessible? These are all thoughts that are part of that experience that I don't have to think about as an able-bodied person. It's a privilege. It doesn't mean that I have to be mad that I have that privilege because I was born with two healthy functioning legs. It it just means it's a privilege that I don't have to think about that my brain never needs to be consumed by these steps. And to your point about allyship, I remember when I had babies in strollers and I would go through doors that were supposed to be wheelchair accessible. And so they were supposed to be automatic. And the amount of doors that wouldn't work. So, trying to get the stroller through, or spaces that couldn't accommodate a stroller, let alone a wheelchair. And my kids will tell you, I make it a habit now of, whenever I go places, to flip, and I'm tall enough to do it. There's a switch above the door on most wheelchair accessible doors where you just flip it on, because sometimes they get turned off at night, I think. You just flip it on,
Oh,
and I find myself clearing the way as if I still had a stroller.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's not something that became relevant to me till I was in that position. And I'm leveraging my privilege now because I don't have to push a stroller anymore. And I maybe help people that are coming behind me that do, or, have a stroller or a wheelchair. So that was just an example that stuck with me. But I really love how you position that as a superpower. In fact, it's one of your superpowers in terms of how you take all these tough conversations and you really focus on what we can do about it. Because I think it could be very overwhelming thinking, gosh, I don't know how to be an ally. I don't want to use the wrong words. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to show up in the wrong way. And I think let's, as much as a lot of good intentions out there, I do think there are some people who are missing the point. And you and I connected on this specific topic. I think we've lost track a little bit of what diversity, equity, inclusion is really about. I love a quote from your website where you say diversity and inclusion initiatives that try to group people into categories as gender, ethnicity, and age, that provides a narrow view of what shapes who we truly are, who our identities are really made up of. No one is defined by one single category. We're influenced by many factors. And then you talk about this in relation to intersectionality. So tell me a little bit about where you think we've ended up here with DE and I, with all the focus that we're trying to put on it. And then I'd love to understand what intersectionality really means as well.
So, and I only take a breath because it's so overwhelming to think how far we thought we came
Mm.
to where we really are right now. In the wake of George Floyd's murder, there were so many knee-jerk reactions. I understand why, but there was there was there was a I'll be direct. There was a lot of inauthentic conversations happening because companies were afraid of losing money. And there was a sudden surge of spend, of time, of leaning on Black folk, Indigenous folk to re traumatize them, quite frankly, in many conversations, of leaning on them to hear their stories and then not doing anything about it.
Hmm.
And so a lot of people feel very used at this point. And then people who were starting these conversations feel burnout.
Hmm.
There's a DEI burnout. And I think, interesting. Instead of looking at the actual structures, policies, and practices that we have in our workplaces that are holding up and perpetuating inequalities between us, we instead decided to shine it up
Hmm.
and have a lot of fanfare instead of doing the difficult work of having these conversations that we've never had in the workplace before. We instead decided to just fire people who said something that we didn't like or that we felt was remotely offensive. Then we created this culture of fear where people had no space to air or to grow or to say, I don't understand why this is offensive. I don't understand why I can't say or do this. I don't understand why we need this policy. Now, as a woman, as a Black woman, does it hurt when someone says, I don't understand why we, yes, it does. It does. It does. But I don't think someone should be fired for that. I think they should be educated on that. But I can tell you, Marissa, I was brought in to many corporate conversations where I could see very clearly that it was 100% performative,
Hmm.
where I have been told, no, it's just easier for us to let him go. But please, can you come and do this DEI training? Because, of course, we have to appear to be addressing the problem.
Mhm.
So that's what happened. I feel happened there. And now we're in a position where I feel we really need a reset.
Mm.
We really need to get back to the difficult work of combing through all of our policies and practices, of not just trotting people out during Black History Month, during on Orange Shirt Day. Like, we need to get past this performance. It's been 4 years, and we don't realize, hey, that wasn't working. So yeah, I do feel a bit of a reset needs to happen. When you talked about the different parts of our identity and about intersectionality, the reason understanding that concept is very important is because it will help you to understand things like, for example, when you are trying to understand why certain demographics in your workplace are disengaging. And first, I'll say, if you haven't heard the term before, it's a term that was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a
Mm.
professor at the UCLA School of Law. She specializes in race and gender issues. If you want to look her up, please feel free to go ahead. And really, she defines this as the intertwining of social identities like gender, race, ethnicity, social class, religion, sexual orientation, etc., etc., people are often disadvantaged by multiple sources of oppression. And we can think about Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is facing discrimination because she's a woman. But she is also facing a specific type of discrimination because she is also Black and a woman. She's not only facing gender discrimination. And that makes me think about when I was still in corporate, after a while, I stopped attending Women's Day panels.
Hmm.
I stopped participating. I would no longer accept invitations to be on those panels. Why? Because I really felt erased in those conversations. Why? Because during those panel discussions, whenever I would bring up the particular challenge that I have been through in the workplace, because I am a Black woman, it would get real silent, Marissa,
Mm.
real silent. And the message that sent to me was that we only want you to talk about the parts of you that we're comfortable with. The message that I picked up in the room was when we're talking about women's issues, we're talking about white women. We're not talking about you. We're not talking about you and you and you. No, you have to kind of wait your turn. Let's deal with this first, and then we'll talk about that in February.
Right.
And that was problematic for me. Very problematic for me. Because I can't separate these two things. You know what I mean?
Right.
I can't show up at a Women's Day event and just talk about my gender. I cannot separate these things.
Yeah. You and I, and you even share it openly on your website in your bio, talked about being a diversity hire, have experience finding out that you were ultimately hired because you were a woman. And this is a tricky topic because there are certainly people out there that think that we should just be out creating opportunities and just making sure that we hire more people of color or more women. And I don't think people of color and women want to just be hired because they're a person of color or just because they're a woman. They just don't want to not be hired because they're a person of color or a woman or a woman of color.
Right.
And I think people are missing the boat on that. And as an organization or a country, if you can't put people in power or hire people, if you're not attracting people, a diverse subset of individuals who are applying to your jobs, that's what you need to look at. Why do we keep attracting the same type of person? Why do we keep attracting the similar types of candidates? Are we advertising in the right spots? Are we, what are the barriers to entry to make sure that all the amazing candidates are not getting hired because they have an element of diversity, because they're a marginalized group? I do not want to be hired or given any special treatment just because I'm a woman. But I also do not want to be discriminated against just because I'm a woman. And not everybody agrees with that. And I'm curious about, and this just even came up, in the last 24 hours, people saying Kamala should have been elected because she was a woman. And I'm like, I strongly disagree. People should want her to be elected because they think she had the best platform and that she was the best candidate. And I don't want to get into the politics of the whole thing, but I don't think she was looking to become president just because she's a woman.
Yeah.
But she sure as heck should not be excluded just because she's a woman. What are your thoughts on that?
When we specifically in the workplace, when we lean on these type of quotas, it's harmful all around.
Hmm.
It's harmful to the person hired, and it's harmful to the business. Because if you are hiring someone who is not qualified, but they check a box for you, of
Mm-hmm.
course, they won't be able to fully do the job. And of course, they will be left feeling, why am I here? Or left feeling like out of sorts, out of their depth, right? And I know that this happens. So I don't think we should sit here and pretend like this doesn't happen, because it does.
Mm-hmm.
There are many organizations who, at one point in time, maybe not so much now, but certainly a few years ago, were just sort of going out and cherry picking. However, while I would say yes, it happens, I do not believe for a second that it happens to an extent where we can surmise that, oh, there's a great majority of people of color who are in jobs that they're unqualified for. I
Right.
don't. Because tell you something about minorities. 9 out of 10 times, we are more qualified because we have had to work harder.
Mm-hmm.
You'd put any woman in a corporate scenario who checks all, like, you have the education, you've been experienced, etc., and it comes down to you and a man with the same experience. What's not happening more often is them saying, oh, well, let's just choose her because she's a woman. What's happening more than often than not is they're saying, she doesn't have X, Y, Z. She doesn't have P, Q, A, B, C, this, and this. John doesn't have it either. But you know what? He'll learn that. It's fine. He'll learn that on the job. Or he's so passionate. It'll be fine. Or she has young kids. You know what? She may not stay in this role for a long time. Or she may not want to do all the travel that this role requires.
Mm-hmm.
That is what is happening more often than not. And people think that this is something where, like, oh, they just see an applicant like, no, we're not hiring her because she's a woman. No one's saying that. Maybe some people do, but that's not
No.
how it goes. It's these very subtle, insidious, like, thoughts, feelings, assumptions that lead to women's inequality. No one's there blatantly, saying, oh no, we're just not going to hire women. No. And that's what makes it so dangerous, because we are all susceptible to having these thoughts, feelings, biases, assumptions.
Yeah, and it's funny because sometimes, you know, and I'm speaking from experience, you get hired. Okay, we've hired all these women.
Mhm.
Fantastic. Well, now what? Right? How do
Yeah.
we make sure these women get the services and the support and the opportunities? Like, how do we keep them? We've got them here. We've attracted them. We've met our quotas. We've checked a lot of boxes, as you said. It's an expression I use all the time. Okay, we've got one of each. We've got this. It's like we've checked our list
Yeah.
and we've done all the things we set out to do. But how do you keep these people? How do you create further
Yeah.
opportunity and to your point, move beyond the optics of having fulfilled a specific mandate in a specific calendar year? Strategic goal accomplished. Check. How do you keep these individuals
Yeah.
happy? And it's funny, when I I became an executive in a very large organization, and I was the youngest. I had young children, and there's a lot of travel involved, and I was game for sure. I committed to it. I knew what I was getting myself into. But I look around the table and I thought, we could make these 3-4 day meetings into 2 day meetings. And I'm sure
Yeah.
all the men around this table would love to go home too. If we start a little bit earlier, or if we work a little bit later, or do a working lunch, everyone can go home a little sooner. In fact, I met Ann Curry, the American broadcaster, once at an event, and she talked
Mm.
about exactly that. She said, I had children. It didn't stop me from doing my job. It just looked a little bit different. And instead of
Yeah.
going on these 3-4 day trips overseas to interview dignitaries and do whatever project or work we were working on, I said, hey guys, let's just work around the clock and get out of here in 48 hours. And she goes, it wasn't just me that benefited from that. Every single crew that came
Mhm.
with me was so much happier to go home, and it was much more efficient, and everyone just wanted to get back to their families. So again, going
Yeah.
back to that equity piece, or not just that, thinking outside the box. When you hire people with diverse backgrounds, you bring a diverse way of looking at problems that maybe you could fix in a different way. So I 100% get behind that idea of, let's get people here, but then how do we also keep them happy?
Yeah, because it's not to say that special measures aren't necessary. I believe they are necessary. Even the program under which when I accidentally found out I was a diversity hire, It is a good program in theory.
Mm.
These programs, without actual follow up, without support, without clarity on why they exist, is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
When I came into that program, so the program was a 1 year program straight out of school with the nation's broadcaster. For 1 year, they chose the top performing students of with a background with an ethnic background from the class, top two, and put them in, allow them to apply for this program. It wasn't automatic. You applied, you did the interview, etc. They chose who they wanted to choose, and you would work for half the year in radio, half the year in television. Fantastic. That program has been the leap pad for the first one of the first women to wear a hijab to be on news. It has been the pathway for many advancements that television news in Canada desperately needed and needs. However, number one, no one actually told me that that's what was happening. Apart from that, it became clear to me on reflection that the existing workforce did not understand or agree with this program,
Mm.
because I would get these really off-putting comments that I didn't realize were this sort of resentment towards this program, and I only started putting two and two together after I realized what was happening. And so you put a young person straight out of university, it's my first job, and you put me in a position where I'm resented and I don't even know why. There is no mentor, coach, guide, lead, nothing like that. And I'm trying to figure out, is it something that I'm doing? Am I not doing my job right? Am I, and you're already insecure at being your first job. So now you're going home at night, running back every single thing that you've done.
Mm-hmm.
It takes your brain space away from being able to do your job. And if the person fails, at the end of it, you'll say, you see, that's why we shouldn't hire them. They can't cut it. That for me is what is dangerous about these programs.
Yeah, and again, I can speak from experience. You look around the room once you get hired, and you think, oh gosh, people think I got this job because I'm a woman, even though I know I'm 100% qualified to be here and I earned
Mhm.
this spot. The optics do not look good, and you end up working twice as hard. So sadly for you, you put 200% effort into a role where had they hired someone else, they would have put 100% in. So it's a win for the company. You're going to outperform, but I would not let myself prove them right. I was going to prove everybody wrong. And,
Yeah.
a win for the organization when you get more out of someone. And yeah, and your point earlier about minorities. I mean, I had a good friend Hanan on this podcast a few episodes ago. She's a refugee, and she said, hire a refugee. You'll never meet a harder worker. She said,
Mhm.
someone, if they can show up and do all these things with everything that they've gone through, with English not being their first language, with not knowing perhaps where their next meal's coming from, or if they can stay in this country, or if their family's safe back home, if they can show up and do a job with all of that weighing on them, they can do anything. And I think there's a lot of power and truth to that for sure. I want to talk to you about, you're a parent, I'm a parent, and these
Mhm.
are tough conversations for adults to have. You mentioned, being on a panel and everyone getting silent. I want to come back to tough conversations because it's a passion project of mine. But I remember back during Black Lives Matter movement with George Floyd, and my children were young. They were like 4 and 6. And I remember reaching out to a good friend of mine. She's actually at TOA. She's the woman who introduced me to you. Sadly, she's no longer with us, but she was an amazing communicator, an amazing soul. And she said to
Yeah.
me, she goes, Marissa, you don't need to teach your small children about racism. But you do need to teach them values. You need to teach them that we're a family that does not treat people differently because of how they look. Do not treat people differently because they're different. We love and care people for who are different. And she's like, the best you can do with kids at this age is to teach them love and acceptance and values until they can process what's going on in their heads. And I know not everybody agrees with me. And I know there are people out there who wanted to educate their kids. But I remember the first time reading a Rosa Parks book to my daughter. It was one of those women hero books. And I just could just see the look on my face with my daughter's face. She was so confused why someone would hate someone just because they have a different color
Yes.
skin. And I thought, oh my goodness, did I plant this seed or is this making her aware? Is this the right time? Like, how do you
Mm.
deal with it as a parent, these tough conversations, these tough situations? And what kind of advice do you give to parents to have these conversations?
Well, it's I wanted to directly respond to what you said, and I don't want to say I disagree because I agree to a point.
Mm-hmm.
I do disagree with we don't need to teach our kids about racism, and the reason I disagree is because I think it's impossible to avoid, and I think if we're not teaching about it, then we're avoiding,
Mm-hmm.
and avoidant parenting for me never works out. um, but I was hesitating because I thought is do I feel that way because I can't avoid it and my children can't avoid it? It may be that. And what I mean by that is I know that my child will face some form of racism at some point in time. I don't know what age, I don't know how early, I don't know when, but I know it's a fact. And for me, as a Black parent, my responsibility is how will I prepare you for when that happens? And so I think, okay, if me as a Black parent, that's my responsibility, then what is your responsibility as a white parent? Is it your responsibility then if I am telling you that this is a fact that is going to happen, and if you believe me, then you will also understand that your daughter, your son, your child may be present when this thing eventually happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so then is your responsibility not to prepare them for when this happens, for when they observe this incident, for when they overhear, for when their best friend comes to them and says, so and so said my skin looks like dirt? How does your what language does your daughter have to hold that space for her friend if you didn't teach it to her? That's what I think about. Um, age appropriateness is important, absolutely. And it's been so important for me to make sure I connect with educators in this space to ask them their opinion. When my daughter, being the spritey, very assertive, little one that she is, was talking about the outfits that she wants to wear. And even though to me, she seemed very stereotypically girly, when she was a toddler, she would very often get mistaken for a boy,
Mm-hmm.
which I found very fascinating to observe. And I bought her this book called Mary Wears What She Wants. And it's the real story of the first woman to wear pants. And she's 9 years old now, my daughter. But I bought her that book when maybe she was maybe 5 or 6, I think. And just last week, she pulled that book out of the closet and said, Mom, can you read my story? I said, yeah. She pulled that book and said, this is one of my favorite books. I was like, really? Because I remember reading it, a couple of times.
Yeah.
But at 9 years old, she says to me, this is my favorite book. And we read through it again. She didn't have to ask me. She wasn't confused as to why people were shouting at Mary, were throwing stones at Mary, were protesting against Mary for wearing pants. because she has obviously felt some level of this unfairness in her own actual life. I
Mm.
didn't have to plant this. I didn't, you know what I mean? Because she didn't ask, oh, why? When they were young, both my son and my daughter, they never seemed to be confused as to why this would happen. They seemed to be confused as to why it's still happening now.
Mm.
They had this very kind of like, oh, this they taught me that this is kind of like happening in the past, right? And so I never felt like I was burdening them, with something. It is possible for us to do that as parents, mind you, right? It's very possible for us to project things onto our children that they don't experience, and I'm very mindful of that. And my 13-year-old son takes pleasure in calling out when he thinks I'm teetering on that line. Um, and I have to kind of hold back, right? But as humans, we do that. We project. That's what we do. So you have to be mindful of that, absolutely. But my essential point is my child, Marissa, will experience these things. They are not too, their age doesn't spare them racism, doesn't insulate them from racism. And so if we have two children of the same age, if my child is experiencing it, I also want your child to know, to be empowered to respond to it, to be the one who knows how to practice that allyship in that moment, to be the one that might take a risk and put up her hand and say, excuse me, miss, that's wrong. Excuse me, I don't like the way that you spoke to my friend. Or, why are we in this group? Because we're girls. Why didn't you give us an opportunity to go to that STEM conference? Why is it that you asked so and so to represent the class? Why is this person always speaking on behalf of the class and not me, and not this person or that person?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I want your daughter, I want my daughter to be the ones who feel empowered, but they can't be empowered to do that unless you and I give them some age appropriate language. They're not going to pull that from the air, because what they will pull from the air if we don't intervene as parents is the usual racist and sexist undertones of messages that they get from the media. That is all they have to draw on. And quite frankly, you and I as parents both know they are being influenced way more by that than by us. So I do feel that we do have a responsibility as parents to intervene and at least give them the language to rebut any kind of ism.
This is your gift, Camille. You have a way to make this feel like it's manageable. And I'm not saying we're solving the world's problems here, but everything you just said, I want to thank you for disagreeing with me. I want to thank you for giving me that, because you're absolutely right. I do want my children to be the ones who are actual allies in how they show up. And I want them to leverage their privilege for good. Those are the types of kids that I'm trying to raise, while also trying to help inform my own generation and generations before me on how we can do better with these tough conversations, and how we show up better for each other. So I appreciate that. I'm going to listen to that part back again and make note, and make sure I have those conversations. And just to confirm, this was many years ago before COVID, when I felt it wasn't age appropriate to have certain types of conversations, but I do have a lot more conversations today. I think, to your point, I don't want them hearing it from someone else. I want them hearing it from me. And that's really important. And to build on that, you share this gift in so many ways. You're out there speaking. You do a lot of great work. You're the founder of the IDEA practice, where you lead as a diversity, equity, and inclusion educator. You're relentless in your pursuits, and I love that about you. But you've also partnered with Dalhousie University, and they're offering their first online micro-credential course, and it's called Inclusion or Inclusive Communications. So first, you're going to explain to me what a micro-credential is, and then you're going to tell me about this incredible course.
Micro credentials have become more and more common in the last couple of years as academic institutions have realized that people who work want to advance their education. And I think, as it might be a bit too radical for an academic institution to admit how irrelevant 4 year degrees are becoming. But I would say that they have recognized that there is an opportunity for them to fill a gap in professionals who want to advance their education but are not going to invest in a 4 year degree. They simply don't have the bandwidth to do that. And so micro credentials are buildable. You can build one on the other and put together a degree or some type of qualification based on what you're working on. So Dalhousie reached out and said, "Hey, we want to do a micro credential in DEI for the workplace, and this is the first of its kind in the country that is accredited by a university." So I was really honored to be able to co-create that with them. It was over a year of research and submitting all of my references and putting that whole course together. It was a really beautiful challenge. So the course is available for any professional or any person, and you don't have to be a professional, but anyone who wants to advance their knowledge in this area. It's geared towards professionals because the examples and the references are rooted in workplace interactions.
Mm.
And so I focused on communication because when I was building the course, I had, of course, so much content, so many things that I speak about. And I thought, okay, well, I have to find a common thread to bring this all together. And I also looked at where I was getting the most friction, the most requests, and it came from communication, how we speak to each other, the words that we use. And I thought, this is a good starting point for any workplace. You must go beyond this, and I stress this in the course, to look at your policies, practices, etc. But getting everyone on the same page about definition. So I'm glad you started by asking me, let's level set. And someone who's a bit more advanced listening to that conversation person might be like, why is she asking her to define these things? You would be very surprised as to how many of us
Mhm.
are using these terms or practicing in these terms and don't actually understand what they mean. So the course is fairly foundational, but gives real life examples as to how these things play out in your workplace. And instead of the quizzes and the tests, there are interactive scenarios that you have to go
Mhm.
through to get to the next part of the course. And I love the way that we were able to organize it so that you learn as you answer, because there's no, right or wrong answer. It gives you a scenario, and every time you select a response, it'll give you a pop-up and a little explanation as to
Mm.
why this response is effective or not effective. So you're getting immediate feedback as to, wait a minute, okay, so when I do this or when I say that, how is this most likely to land with somebody, or how effective would it actually be and why? Because we all want to understand, the root causes of things.
It sounds incredible, and I think everyone can benefit from something like this because, again, I think people just are avoiding conversations because they don't want to say the wrong thing. People are remaining silent. I've had
Mhm.
people say to me, well, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole because my job will be on the line, or I don't want to risk
Right.
doing the wrong thing. And it comes from educating. And again, then people say, well, I don't know where to get the right information. Well, here's a great place to
Yes.
get the right information, to level set, to empower you with the right knowledge and the right language. Because great leaders out there need to be doing something about this, not just learning, but then sharing that knowledge. And I want to talk about you as a leader because I mean, you're on this podcast because I believe you're an incredible leader. And I think a lot of people would share that with me. I mean, you have so many accolades and awards, Camille. The work you've done is so impressive. You're even recognized as one of the top 100 accomplished Black women in Canada. I mean, what an impressive award and title. And I'm so grateful. I mean, it might be easier for you some days just to not do this work because it's probably very difficult work to have to roll up your sleeves and maybe sometimes constantly go back to basics and do the foundational work to be able to take, 10 steps back to then be able to take one big leap forward. But I want to know from you, like, do you see yourself as a leader? And what to you, what defines a good leader?
I think I think any good leader knows has probably mastered the art of knowing when to be in front and when to fall behind.
Hmm.
And even that phrase fall behind has such a negative connotation in the leadership space. But for me, what is at the core of effective leadership is being able to surrender my ego. I battle my ego from day to night in every interaction because I am so cognizant of how much it influences my every response.
Mm.
Before I respond to an email, before I prepare myself for a difficult conversation with a member of our team, before I prepare myself for an awkward conversation with a friend or a family member, I check in with my ego first and I give it a good smack. So many of us are leading with our ego. And I think really the hallmark of a leader is one who knows when there are some times when your ego will help you, but most times it will hinder you. But it is very difficult because patriarchy, to be honest, convinced us that a good leader is very prideful and very full of ego. But a leader who leans in, I think, to vulnerability is way more effective with longevity.
I could not agree more. And I can't believe time is flying by. I feel like I could talk to you for many more hours, and we'll probably have you back. But I have a few last questions I really want to ask you. So I'm going to get them in and we'll do them fast because I just think they're so important. I'd love to. I mean, we already talked about where we can get some information. The Dalhousie course is great. Where else, if people wanted to self educate, would you send them?
I'll send you to the great World Wide Web because there are no shortages of people curating information on very specific niche topics, as well as do not forget about your local library. I am
Mm.
such a library proponent, and I'm glad to see our province and our city reinvesting in libraries. Um, there are so many resources that I have leaned on from my local library. So I would point you in that direction.
As a member of the non-black community, as a white woman, as a mom, and as someone who really wants to be an ally to marginalized groups and minorities, what are, let's say, three things that I can do?
Mhm. Um, I would say first ask yourself very simple but important question of why. Why do I want to be an ally? And then I want you to first look at yourself. And when I say that, I mean really self reflect, really examine the way that you've responded to things, the way that you think about things, and where did I get those from? Where did I get those thoughts from? Who do they benefit? Who do they harm? Look at yourself, then look at your inner circle. Evaluate that. Then evaluate the purpose of every conversation that you have around equity. Whenever you find yourself starting a conversation, whether it's online or in person, etc., when I say evaluate, I mean ask yourself, am I having this conversation to make me feel better? Or am I having this conversation so that I can learn something or that I can educate somebody else? And am I going to enter this conversation willing to be wrong?
Yeah, those are those are great questions, and I think perhaps sometimes we are doing things for the wrong reasons, as we alluded to earlier, or we aren't fully engaged or in tune with why we want to do something, what purpose it's truly serving, if it's self-serving or an externally serving purpose. And I think we should probably ask ourselves more questions like that, for sure. What what is next for you? Where can people find you? What are you working on? Where, how can people connect and follow the work that you do?
I'm probably most active on LinkedIn, so feel free to follow and connect with me there and send me a message. I am working on building out more components of the course. So I am looking for fellow experts with different intersections, disabilities, faith, um, neurodivergences.
Mhm.
So we're looking to build out the course is a kind of a baseline, and we're trying to get more detailed on different parts of diversity and equity and inclusion that are proving to be challenges for workplaces to figure out how to include. I've done a talk recently on multi-generational workplaces. So I'm looking for an ageism expert to help me build out that part of the course. So we're really trying to pay attention to what the people that we've been speaking to, what challenges they are actually facing in the workplace, as opposed to saying, hey, this is what we think you should be talking about. What are the real challenges day to day that are coming up? So that's what we're working on right now.
Amazing. I have to ask you a couple rapid fire questions. We'll do it quickly, but I have to know, when you're not out there educating and spreading all this good and working so hard to uh, bring us all along with you, what do you do in your spare time?
Spare time. That sounds like a luxury. Um, but any spare time, I love playing my 90s R&B playlist. So it's all
Mm,
Anita Baker, Tony Braxton. I love singing at the top of my lungs whenever I can, particularly in the car. So I love filling our home and my life with music, and just being in awe of my. I think one of my favorite pastimes is eavesdropping on their conversations because the things they come out with are wildly entertaining and sometimes very inspiring and educational.
I couldn't agree more. I always say I wish my kids were mic'd up 24 hours a day because the stuff that comes out of their
I've
mouths
considered it.
is priceless. I mean, they could have their own they could have their own podcast, not
No, 100%.
not YouTube channels because they want those and I won't let
Oh
them.
yeah, yeah. I
But
would also
there's
recommend.
probably a lot to learn from their little minds.
There's a show, I think it's out of Australia or the UK on YouTube called The Secret Life of 4-Year-Olds.
Oh my goodness.
And I would highly recommend anyone watching that show. Oh, reality TV is also one of my favorite pastimes. But that show is so fascinating. They mic up the kids and they put them in like a closed environment, like a daycare environment, and give them, it's kind of like Survivor for kids. And they give them these challenges, like build this playhouse together or cook a meal, but they're literally like 5 years old. So it tells us it's like a wild experiment on human behavior, and you just see how gender and race and socioeconomic background and all of these things impact how the children interact with each other. It's very fascinating.
From the mouth of babes. Can't go wrong. Well, listen, Camille, it was really nice to have you here today. It was such an honor. I so appreciate you being here and forcing tough conversations because I want to get people talking more. And if people listen to this and spend some time on the World Wide Web researching and maybe land on your pages, follow you on social media, check out your course with Dalhousie. I think there's so much to be learned. And I think a great leader needs to spend time to make sure we're out there teaching and encouraging people to know more and do better. So I want to thank you for all the work that you do. I'm a big fan and I'm grateful for everything you shared with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marissa.